This is Terrence Andre Banks with Information Age Financial Solutions, coming to you again about the economy and a great article I came across from Sovereign Man. And the reason why the title, of course, anything sticks out to me. This may be the beginning of the great financial reckoning. But when I was thinking about how much debt that the United States is incurring, and then the financial balance sheets of many people in terms of how much credit card debts and just debt in general, how we were taking on, it just made me do a pause here to think about when has it ever been in history where taking on massive amounts of debt leads to something good. It usually leads to crashes. And this article here does a great job of explaining a lot. So it's pretty lengthy, and I want to get right into it, and it's worth reading, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. I don't visit Sovereign Man often enough, but I do come across their articles, and he does a great job, Simon Black, of just really pointing a lot of different things out. So let's get right into it. Less than 2 weeks ago, the United States Department of Treasury very quietly released its own internal projection of the federal government's budget deficits over the next several years. And the numbers are pretty gruesome. In order to plug the gaps from its soaring deficit, the Treasury Department expects to borrow nearly $1 trillion this fiscal year, then nearly $1.1 trillion next fiscal year, and up to $1.3 trillion the year after that. This means that the national debt will exceed $25 trillion by September 30th, 2020. Remember, this isn't some wild conspiracy theory. These are official government projections published by the United States Department of Treasury. The story alone is monumental. Not only does the U.S. owe by far the greatest amount of debt ever accumulated by any single nation in human history, but $25 trillion is larger than the debts of every other nation in the world combined. But there are other themes at work here that are even more important. Again, that's why I started, before I got into this article, about when is owing debt and not leading to a problem ever been not talked about and can be considered to be afraid of. They just like collapses. And again, the United States debt is far by the greatest amount of debt ever accumulated by any single nation in human history. But America is the greatest place to live on, I guess. And I'm only saying this in jest, of course, I'm an American citizen. I love my country. But this is insane. And until we start really recognizing that, what the problems that we're facing, we really come to terms with it and stop blanking over things, then we're headed for even more of a serious issue than we can ever imagine. For example, how is it remotely possible the federal government can burn through $1 trillion? Everything is supposed to be totally awesome in the United States. The economy is strong, unemployment is low, tax revenue is at record levels. It's not likely that they had to fight a major two-front war, save the financial system from an epic crisis, or battle a severe economic depression. It's just been business as usual, nothing really out of the ordinary. And yet they're still losing trillions of dollars. This is pretty scary when you think about it. What is going to happen to the United States federal deficit when there actually is a financial crisis or a major recession? Very good points. And none of these possibilities are factored into their projections. The largest problem of all, though, is the federal government is going to have a much more difficult time borrowing the money. For the past several years, the government has always been able to rely on the usual suspects to loan the money and buy up all the debt, namely the Federal Reserve, the Chinese, and the Japanese. Those three alone have loaned trillions of dollars to the United States government since the end of the financial crisis. The Federal Reserve, in particular, though through its quantitative easing programs, was on an all-out binge buying up every long-dated treasury bond it could find, like some sort of junkie debt addict. And both Chinese and Japanese holding U.S. government debt now exceeded $1 trillion each, more than double what they were before the 2008 crisis. But now each of these three lenders is out of the game. The Federal Reserve, let me repeat that again, and both the Chinese and Japanese holding of U.S. government debt now exceeded $1 trillion each, more than double what they were before the 2008 crisis. But now each of these three lenders are out of the game. The Federal Reserve has formally ended its quantitative easing program. In other words, the Fed has said it will no longer conjure money out of thin air to buy the U.S. government debt. The Chinese government said point blank last month that they were rethinking their position on U.S. government debt. And the Japanese have their own problems at home to deal with. They need to scrap together every penny they can to find to dump into their own economy. Official data from the U.S. Treasury Department illustrates this point. Both China and Japan have slightly reduced their holdings of U.S. government debt since last summer. Bottom line, all three of U.S. government biggest lenders are no longer buyers of U.S. debt. There's a pretty obvious conclusion here. Interest rates have to rise. It is a simple issue of supply and demand. The supply of debt is rising, demand is falling. That means that the price of debt will decrease, ergo interest rates will rise. Think about it like this. With so much supply and lower demand for its debt, the U.S. government will have to pay higher interest rates in order to attract new lenders. Make no mistake here, higher interest rates will have an enormous impact on just about everything. Many major asset prices tend to fall when interest rates rise. Rising rates mean that it costs more money for companies to borrow, reducing their leverage and overall profitability. So stock prices typically fall. It is also important to note that over the last several years, when interest rates were basically zero, companies borrowed vast sums of money at almost no cost to buy back their own stock. They were essentially using record low interest rates to artificially inflate their share prices. Those days are rapidly coming to an end. Property prices also tend to do poorly when interest rates rise. Here's a simplistic example. Love this simplistic example. If you afford the monthly mortgage payment to buy a $500,000 house, when interest rates were at 3%, the same monthly payment will only buy a $250,000 house when rates rise to 6%. Repeat that again. Here's a simplistic example. If you can afford the monthly mortgage payment to buy a $500,000 house when interest rates are 3%, that same monthly payment will only buy a $250,000 house when rates rise to 6%. And we had another housing binge, and rates and real estate is going up dramatically since the last 2008 crisis. Rising rates means that people won't be able to borrow as much money to buy a home, and this typically causes property prices to fall. Of course, higher interest rates also mean the U.S. government will take a major hit. Remember, the federal government already has to borrow money just to pay interest on the money they've already borrowed. So when interest rates go up, they'll be paying even more each year in interest payments, which means they have to borrow even more money to make those payments, which means they'll be paying even more in interest payments, which means they have to borrow more, even more, etc., etc. It's a pretty nasty cycle. As we discussed many times before, the U.S. economy is based on consumption, not production. Consumption, not production. I want to repeat that again. And it depends heavily on cheap money, i.e. low interest rates, and cheap oil in order to keep growing. We're already seeing the end of both of those, at least for now. Both oil prices and interest rates have more than doubled from their lows, and it stands to reason that at minimum, interest rates will keep climbing. And to continue, so this may well be, I kind of jumped a little ahead here. So this may well be the start of the great financial reckoning. And to continue learning how to ensure you, all right, he goes into his plan B here. It's a free download. You might be encouraged to take a look at it. This article was very poignant, and it pointed out a ton of great things. A lot of things that I've said before on this channel and doing different videos and based on the different articles that I read. We live in the information age. We need financial solutions to be able to get us over the threshold and make that change. Keep abreast of things. Keep looking at my channel. Subscribe if you found any value to this. And until my next video, I'm out.